Interesting TCM and Acupuncture. Part 28. Interesting pulse diagnosis. Pulse diagnosis and clinical practice. 19 transmissions from the Wu family and their explanations. 1. Pulse diagnosis clinical use. The relationship between pulse diagnosis and illness treatment is profoundly complex. This is because practitioners must be able to differentiate the reflections of different illnesses within the basic pulse presentation and the particular pulse presentations of other pathologies, which may also be simultaneously occurring. In clinical usage, we must be careful of the following points. 1. To be able to differentiate the meaning of unique pulse presentations. 2. To classify illness based on pulse differentiation. 3. To differentiate the relative compliance or rebellion of the pulse in relation to the illness. The treatment of specific individual pulses. In clinic, if it's not possible to find out the particular pulse change of a specific illness, it's also in Zhang Jingyue's Complete Works chapter on the pulse spirit, it says, the meaning of individual refers to the individual location of the pulse, or the individual qi of an organ, or the individual shape of a pulse. The individual location of a pulse, if normal, shows no illness. If even slightly changed, it shows that there's a pathogen contained within. This is why it's unique. The individual organ qi, if not obtained in its specific location, shows a constriction. If all pulses are surging, it's a heart pulse. If the 5 organs each have their own unique pulse presentation, the 5 pulses can mix together. If one is off, it means there's an illness. The unique shape of a pulse is explained in the classics as a uniquely small pulse being indicative of an illness, a large pulse being indicative of an illness, a uniquely pathological pulse being indicative of an illness, and a unique slow pulse being indicative of an illness. However, if you find one of them, it shows that there's a basis for concern of the start of an illness. The concept of unique location change illustrates that each individual pulse presentation has its own specific location. For instance, the Guan pulse tends to be slow and wiry characteristic on the left, while the right twin pulse is the only pulse that's supposed to show weak characteristics. These pulses are related specifically to the illnesses in the Zang and Fu organs. If the left Guan position pulse is wiry, it means there's a liver stagnation. If the right twin pulse is weak, it means the lung is deficient. If the left chir pulse is weak, it means the kidney is deficient, and so on. This is how we classify pulse location and illnesses of the organs. Unique organ qi refers to frequently encountered pulses which reflect pathologies of the organs. For instance, knotted, intermittent, and irregular pulses are often seen in illnesses of the heart. Other illnesses, such as those related to the liver, often present as wiry, while lung illnesses often present as floating. Spleen illnesses often present as unhurried, and kidney illnesses often present as deep. Each of the 5 organs has its own unique pulse presentation, and it, if seen alone, shows an illness. Unique pulse body illustrates sudden appearance of illness which can be observed in the pulse presentation. These pulses help us to understand specific illness issues pertaining to illness. For instance, a slippery pulse shows phlegm damp accumulation, damp heat, food accumulation, etc., while a tight pulse shows cold damage and pain. A soggy pulse shows spleen vacuity and a damp disturbance, while a hidden pulse shows pathogens locked on the interior. Fainting illness and extreme pain. A hollow pulse shows loss of blood and extreme yin injury. Differential pulse diagnosis and specifications. Pulse presentation theory typically holds that floating pulse is indicative of exterior illness, while deep pulse indicates interior. Fast indicates heat, while slow indicates cold. Wiry and large indicates excess, while thin and minute indicates vacuity. However, these external, internal, cold, hot, vacuous, excess pulses may also present us with issues of whether they are true or false presentations, so we must pay attention. Zhang Jingyue's Pulse Spirit chapter says the following. Floating, although belonging to exterior, may also present in cases of yin vacuity with lack of blood. Central qi damaged and lacking. Then, in this case, it must present with floating and without strength. Thus, we mustn't advocate that floating is always a case of exterior illness. Although deep pulses are typically associated with the interior, in cases of interior pathogen beginning to enter the deep layers of the body and cold attaching to the meridians and collaterals, the pulse may not be able to arrive and thus present as deep and tight. In such cases, we must not always assume that deep pulses are necessarily interior illnesses. Fast pulses are associated with heat, but true heat does not always present as fast. Normally, vacuity and damage presents as yin and yang both experiencing exhaustion. Qi and blood both extend in fright. and vacuous presentation can also be very fast. So we mustn't always say that fast pulses are exclusively the domain of heat. Slow pulses is associated with cold. However, when cold begins to recede, there can be heat which occurs before the qi becomes clear. At this time, the pulse may be slow and slippery. So slow pulse is not exclusively associated with cold. Pulse illness and compliance versus rebellion. The relative compliance and rebellion of pulse conditions relate to whether the pulse resonates or does not resonate. Typically, in differentiating illnesses, we look at the compliance and rebellion. Normally, if the pulse is consistent with the illness, it's compliant. If it runs counter to the illness, it's rebellious. For instance, in a sudden illness, if the pulse is floating, surging fast, or excess, it's compliant in that it means that the upright qi of the body is full and able to fight the pathogen. In long-term illnesses, we see deep, minute, thin, and weak pulses as compliant, since it means the upright qi is not sufficient to fight the pathogen. If there's a new illness in which there is a deep, thin, minute, or weak pulse, this indicates that the upright qi has already declined. After a long illness, if we see floating, surging, fast, and excess pulses, it shows us that the upright qi has declined and that the pathogen is not receded, thus indicating the presence of a rebellious pulse presentation. If the pulse is not resonant with the illness, we must take the pulse into account when we make our differentiation and take our differential diagnosis into account when we take the pulse. If the patient feels vexation, heat, and the pulse is minute and weak, it must be a case of vacuity fire. If the abdomen is distended and full and the pulse is weak and minute, there must be vacuity weakness of the spleen and stomach. If the chest and abdomen are not luminous and the pulse is large, then it must not be a fire pathogen. If there's no distension and fullness pain and the pulse is wiry and hard, it's not an excess condition. The pulse has characteristics of following and losing. 2. Pulse diagnosis meaning. Pulse diagnosis is an essential element of inquiry in Chinese medicine, which we must not be overlooked or undervalued. Pulse diagnosis is important and shows each element of the physiological condition of a human being. It has rules and parameters which allow us to view pathogenic changes in the body as though peeping through a window of a door. And it can be used to differentiate illnesses clearly, so it is an extremely important method to master. Chinese medicine overall holds that the body is an organic holism. The spiritual pivot chapter on the attitude of the pulse says, when yin is flourishing, it is indicative of illness in the organs. When yang is flourishing, the illness is in the viscera. The qi flowing enters the organs and the viscera and externally moistens the interstitial tissue. To put it clearly, each part of the body has specific functions which stimulate the qi of the meridians and collaterals, qi and blood causing their movement to collect, warm and moisten all parts of the body as they nourish them. At the same time, the body interacts with the nature around it, and the meridians and vessel qi and blood all follow the movement of the sun and moon, changing along with them. This is said clearly in the Simple Questions chapter on the subtle essence. The key to pulse analysis is in this. The 4 movements of change can be found in the upper and lower aspect of the pulse. This describes all types of physiological activity and how they impact pulse presentation, its movement characteristics and change relative to time and the issues it is reflecting. However, pulse presentation change has definite limits and rules. For instance, if stomach qi has not been lost, the pulse will be level. When the body is attacked by an external pathogen, this physiological balance will be broken, leading to blood and qi, organ and viscera function decline. This shows in the pulse presentation in the form of various illnesses. Jiang Jingyue's complete works, Pulse Spirit chapter says, the pulse shows the spirit of blood and qi, pathogen and upright, contain them all in like a basket. The center of the body must express itself entirely on the outside of the body. Consider how blood and qi, when flourishing, makes the pulse flourish. When the blood and qi are in decline, the pulse also declines. If there's no illness, the pulse should be regular. If there is illness, the pulse will certainly be pathogenic. Pulse presentation with either flourishing, declining, upright, or unusual characteristics are all reflections of pathogenic and upright qi fighting on the exterior. After diagnosing the pulse, it's possible to understand the degree of excess of deficiency of blood or deficiency of blood and qi, the flourishing and decline of yin and yang, and the relative strength and weakness of organ functions. This allows us to know in advance the advance and retreat of pathogen and upright qi's strengths, and shows us how to go ahead with treatment choices. If doctors do not know how to differentiate according to the pulse, they will not have any differentiation ability. Without this, there's no chance to treat illness. Thus, they must have refined understandings of pulse in order to become a good doctor of Chinese medicine. Pulse diagnosis is an essential meaning of clinical practice and can be defined as the following 4 key elements: differentiation of the location of illness, diagnosis of the nature of illness, clarifying the relative relationship of upright and pathogenic qi and their flourishing and decline, and understanding the prognosis of illness. 1. Differentiating the location of illness. Location of illness is related to the time and place in which an illness occurs. The illness pathogen can be on the exterior or interior, or it can attack specific organs and viscera. The 5 organs and 6 viscera, blood and qi, all connect to the heart vessel. As a result, the organs and viscera and their physiological capacities show when an illness causes change. This affects the blood and qi's normal movement and how it presents in the pulse. A floating pulse is typically a sign of exterior syndrome. A deep pulse is typically a sign of interior syndrome. In the Tun Ko pulses of Tun, Guan, and Chur, on the left belong to the heart, liver, and gallbladder, and kidney. On the right, they belong to the lung, spleen, stomach, and kidney. Each of these positions may experience specialized pathological change, which should then reflect our consideration of how the location relevant organ may be affected. If the 2 Chur positions exhibit minute weak characteristics, this can mostly be put down to kidney qi deficiency decline. Well, if the right Guan position is weak, we might attribute it to stomach and spleen qi deficiency. If the right Tun is surging, typically this is related to heart fire burning upward and upper burner excess heat. The heart rules the blood vessels of the body. All blood vessels belong to the heart, illustrates how pulse and heart are connected without stop. When taking pulse, the physiological capacity of the heart will show. Thus, diagnosis of pulse can help greatly in understanding underlying heart pathology. If there's a hesitant, knotted, or intermittent pulse, this typically relates to heart blood, heart yin, and insufficiency or vacuity of heart qi, heart yang, not plucky, etc. Knowing this, we can see why diagnostic techniques have never stopped progressing, since most of them are based on clinical experience, and thus they can help us in understanding when organ pulses show loss of heart regulation. Many of these illustrate how the heart has experienced pathogenic change. Diagnosing pathogenic change. The nature of illness typically shows with cold, heat, phlegm, stasis, and stagnation, etc. The simple question, subtle essence, pulse discussion says, long means qi is healed, short means qi is ill. Fast means heart vexation, large means illness is entering. Upper flourishing means qi is higher. To clarify, these presentations show specific reflections of pulse within illness patterns. If there is cold and hot, it can change the qi and blood within the body and affects its movement. Fast pulse, surging pulse, slippery pulse, and long pulse are all seen in heat illnesses. Strong pulse means that there is full heat without strength. This means that there is vacuity heat. Slow pulse, tight pulse, and so on are typically seen in cold conditions. With strength, it indicates excess cold. Without strength, it indicates vacuous cold. 3. Differentiating pathogen and upright, flourishing, and decline. Illnesses take place within the battle between the relative flourishing and decline of pathogen and upright qi. This certainly affects the pulse. Thus, when investigating the pulse presentation, we must clearly differentiate relative flourishing and decline of upright and pathogenic. If we meet with a vacuous, thin, weak, minute, short, leather, or intermittent pulse, this is an example of lack of strength and illustrates that qi and blood are insufficient. Essence has been lost, yang energy has declined into minutia, and there is certainly a vacuity syndrome. If we meet excess surging, slippery, wiry, tight, or long pulse, these are all examples of pulses which have strength. In this case, the pathogenic qi is flourishing as it attacks, and the upright qi is not in decline. Then upright and pathogenic will meet and fight. This is a situation in which there will be an excess condition. 4. Diagnosis of entry and retreat. After performing diagnosis and obtaining information about illness, we may then check on the relative strength of the illness in order to understand whether it's more likely to become more severe or improve. We may also investigate whether the treatment works or not. After observing the pulse presentation and deciding the illness, we must collect our information and combine it together. Then we may look at the pulse in more specific terms. If there's an external illness with a floating pulse becoming deep, this shows that the pathogenic qi is already entering the interior. If it's deep and changes to floating, this means that the pathogen is exiting the interior. After a long illness, the pulse may present as unhurried. The pulse strength will gradually increase. If this is the case, then it's a sign of stomach qi gradually returning. This lets us know that the illness is in retreat and beginning to improve. After long illness with blood loss, if there's diarrhea, heat often presents with slippery pulse. If sweat runs out, the heat will recede and the pulse will return to unhurried, showing that the illness is improving. If much sweat comes out, then the heat recedes, the body will be cold and the pulse will convert to hesitant. Then the body will become vexed and illness will enter deeper. At this time, yang may be lost. In Zhang Jingyue's complete works on the chapter on pulse spirit, it says, if wishing to observe illness, entering and receding, healing, and danger, we should check the stomach qi. After using this method, where today the pulse is unhurried and tomorrow it's wiry, then we know that the pathogenic qi is increasing. This pathogenic increase means that the illness will also increase. If today's pulse is wiry and tomorrow is unhurried, then we know the illness is beginning to get better as the stomach qi comes back. When the stomach qi comes back, the illness will gradually improve. If in a short time we see the acute pulse transform to unhurried, it means stomach qi is coming back. But if the unhurried pulse changes to acute, the stomach qi is leaving. This is how to check pathogenic and upright entering and receding. This aside, the pulse and illness presentations typically resonate as one image, but if they're not one, this means that the illness condition is substantially complex, and it may be difficult to treat with poor outcomes. For instance, if there's great blood loss, the pulse is surging, the yuan qi has already been abandoned to the outside. If the illness is cold and hot, and the pulse is thin and weak, the yuan qi is vacuous and is sinking. The zheng qi cannot rise to meet the pathogen. These situations illustrate how pathogenic and upright wax and wane, and illness enters and recedes. This can help us better understand the relative severity of an illness. The Wu family 19 frequently used pulse methods poem. Wu family simplified pulse poem. Floating means holding up, sinking reaches the bones. 1. Floating pulse. 2. Sinking pulse. 3 beats is a slow pulse, 6 beats is fast, 4 beats is unhurried, and 7 beats is acute. Number 3, slow pulse, 4, fast pulse, 6, unhurried or acute, unhurried pulse. Unhurried and stopped means nodded. Fast and stopped mean hesitant. Moving and stopped with difficult change is intermittent. 7, nodded pulse. 8, hesitant. 9, intermittent. Surging like a wave and thin like a thread, long pulse rises up and short pulse constricts. 10, surging. 11, thin. 12, long. 13, short pulses. Wiry pulse is straight and thin has strength. Tight pulse is wiry but is thick and hard. 14, wiry. 15, tight. Slippery pulse is like a pearl flowing in water without stop. Astringent pulse is stagnant and going and coming. It seems difficult. 16, slippery pulse, very fluid in nature. 17, astringent pulse, no longer fluid. Excess and large is long and big. Vacuous and slow is weak and empty. 18, excess pulse, which emphasizes power. 19, deficiency pulse, emphasizes weakness in presentation. From complex to simple. 20, Wei Mai, unique pulse. 21, Ruo Mai, frail pulse. 22, Ru Mai, soggy pulse. 23, San Mai, scattered pulse. 24, Ko Mai, hollow pulse. 25, Ge Mai, leather pulse. 26, Fu Mai, hidden pulse. 27, Lao Mai, confined pulse. 28, Dong Mai, spinning bean or moving pulse. From complex to simple, one should master the 3 visceral pulses of Cun, Guan, and Chi. Cun position is on the left is the heart, and on the right is the lung. Cun, if floating, shows external pathogen, head pain, dizziness, upper burner illness. Left Cun pulse shows the heart illness. Left Cun pulse, if weak, shows that there is heart illness. The heart muscle lacks blood. Heart illness on the left Cun, if showing deep and thin and fast, astringent, wiry, hesitant, nodded, or intermittent, will all show. Right Cun is the lung. The right Cun being thin and fast, or deep and fast, weak and fast, and minute and fast, makes the lung vacuous, lung yin vacuous. The Guan pulse is on the left as the liver, and the right is on the spleen and stomach. Right Guan controls liver. Left Guan is deep and not stable. The liver qi is stagnant and knotted. If left Guan is wiry and fast, there is liver fire burning up. Right Guan, if wiry and slippery, shows liver and gallbladder is damp and hot. Chi pulse shows kidney illness. Chi pulse with a deep, weak shows kidney yang deficiency. Chi pulse deep, thin, and fast shows kidney Yin Deficiency. Chi pulse slippery and fast shows bladder damp heat. Chi pulse wiry shows lower jiao damp heat. It can also show in stone knotted pulse and high blood pressure, as well as transmittable diseases. Frequently seen pulses: phlegm and food damage, slippery and fast. Painful, wiry, and moving pulse. Blood stasis and qi stagnation, astringent and weak. Essence and spirit, wiry, tight, and long, qi depression. Heart pain, unregulated pulses such as hesitant, knotted, and intermittent. Brain blood deficiency, both Guan positions do not have stable pulses. Body lacking strength from overwork, slippery and deficient fast. After eating, floating with large slippery pulse, full with strength. Essence and spirit tired, wiry pulse. Essence and spirit tired usually manifests after a long time when the body begins to dry up from excess thinking and too much work. Because of thinking, too much chi transforms into fire and burns upward from the liver. The pulse image is wiry. In Western medicine, it's held that the excitatory aspect of the CNS frequently experiencing annoyance, lack of sleep, etc., will result in red eyes, lack of circulation in the limbs, and other related nervous system problems. After a long time, this will result in yin deficiency. It will cause injury to the kidney essence and the brain marrow. This will cause the brain to become vacuous and thought will come more slowly. Memory and ability will decline, and so on. This shows in a pulse which is deep, thin, and has no strength. Infrequently seen pulses. Loss of blood, hollow or leather pulse. Thanks for watching.